So, hello everyone, I'm Mason Williams. Today I'll be speaking on one of the first cases of DID, and that is the case of Eve White. Her real name is actually Chris Sizemore, but for the reasons of today, I will be calling her Eve White, and some of her other personalities I'll refer to as other names, but her main personality is referred to as Eve White in most of media as well as like literature that is about her because they did not want to release her real name. So, today I'll be going over the dissociative identity disorder as a whole, as well as how DID was for Eve, and then the effects that her diagnosis had both on psychology and on society as a whole. So, DID. Dissociative identity disorder is when a person possesses two or more identities that are completely separate from one another. These personalities are actually in control of the subject's body while the main personality is sent to the background. That is actually the case for Eve White. However, that is not the case in all cases of DID, as there is some cases where the person is actually, or the main personality, I'm sorry, not the person, is actually cognizant, however they are not able to control their body. And what this also does is this allows for blackouts to happen. For specifically Eve White, she would black out and it would be the other personalities that were in control, so that left her with gaps in her memory as well as spaces where she would end up in spots that she didn't necessarily know how she got there, which obviously is very scary. And then it led to her even missing events in her child's life and her husband's, which led them to be very worried about her, as they were worried that there was something going on, not just mentally. The bigger worry back then, this was around the 1950s, was the bigger worry back then was actually more of a medical issue rather than a mental illness issue. It was believed that she had medical issues. So this actually, there was times that she would switch her personality. There was a personality that was called Eve Black, and this is a person who was much different from her original personality, where it would be flirtatious and even very boisterous, while Eve White is known to be a very quiet person. And Eve Black would even go around flirting with other people unknown to her that she had a husband. And there was also another personality where she would show up as a child, and this transition was so severe that it would change her mannerisms as well as her handwriting. And then we'll go into a little bit more in depth about Eve specifically. So we have the main three personalities, which are Eve White, Eve Black, who I've already talked about both of those, and then there's Jane, who is known as a more intellectual focused personality. And then we move on to the main reasons that dealing with her disorder is so difficult is that she is happy with her husband and her family. However, her other personalities were not. So what this leads to is a lot of difficulty within herself, as she believes herself personally wants to be in this relationship. However, her other personalities will come out and sort of sabotage that relationship that she does have with her family. So essentially, when her transitions would happen, she would have to deal with debilitating headaches, and that is due to the transition of personalities. It was just too much of an overload on her brain while she didn't know what was happening, essentially. So what this led to was her seeking medical treatment. And she had no understanding that there was other personalities coming out at this point, and she did not, she basically was experiencing a lot of weird phenomenon that she could not explain. So these debilitating headaches eventually led her to seek mental help. She did not go to a psychiatrist at first for a while. She was just seeing regular medical professionals until one of her medical practitioners actually referred her to a psychologist, who then referred her to a therapist, who they didn't believe that they didn't know, of course, about anything like this. At this point, DID was very, very new. This is one of the first cases, however, it's not the first. This is one that was recorded very well, which is why I'm talking about it today. So we'll go on. The children actually ended up struggling a lot in this home because she had some stepchildren as well as children of her own in this family, and they had to experience, I would say, a lot more of dealing with this disorder than the father did, as the father was at work a lot of the time, and while Eve was at home taking care of the children, they had to experience a multitude of her personalities, which of course is very difficult for children to deal with, as well as I can't imagine how difficult that would be for Eve to switch back to your main personality and see your children struggling with you. Alright, so let's move on here to her life prior to being diagnosed. She had a lot of therapists. She went through a lot, as none of them were helping her, as they did not know that she had DID. This was not something that was seen as common or even really known about at the time. So essentially she would experience a lot of weird events, a lot of negative mental health effects, and what they thought was she had depression and anxiety was what they brought up that she had. And as we know now, that just, while she may experience things that do make her feel a lot of anxiety and feel a lot of depression, it is stemmed from her dissociative identity disorder. And then we have Eve's diagnosis here. So talking about this, diagnosing dissociative identity disorder is something that's really, really difficult, as it's something that can be very hidden, especially like when it is hidden to the main personality. As Eve White struggled a lot with identifying what her issue was for herself, as she would black out, not even remember what was going on. But this diagnosis actually allowed Eve it brought her a lot of sense of mind, as she wasn't really believed. And I do think a lot of that had to do with the time period, her being a woman, as this was the 1940s, 1950s, and she was more seen as hysterical and a little bit more just, they considered this was stated a lot in media, was she was just crazy, which was, rather than looking into her issues and trying to find the source of those issues, they would just peg her as crazy and then move on. Why deal with her any longer when you already know you can't help her? But they moved on. The diagnosis of DID actually caused her to be extremely happy. She figured out that she knew what was wrong with her. They knew, they were trying to figure out methods that they could attack this with, essentially, and she knew now why she had been blacking out, which for me personally, I know that I would be a lot happier knowing why I was experiencing these blackouts compared to not. So changes that this brought to the field of psychology, this actually brought a lot of changes. It brought up a lot of attention to DID, as Eve White was turned into a movie, and there was various other media things that were made about her, such as books and things. But I believe that this is due to how interesting Eve's case was. She actually, while there were 3 main personalities, there were 27, I think, distinct personalities that were all very different from one another. So that led to a lot of things. But it brought DID into the media, as I'm assuming you guys have seen films such as Split, I think Fight Club, spoiler, sorry. But there's a lot of this led into mental health issues that were just bringing a lot of attention in the media, and that's something that mental health hadn't really been talked about a lot at this point in media, because it was more seen as a negative thing rather than something that is interesting. So here are some of the actual posters from the film. So that's actually something else that I wanted to touch on. All of these, so the woman that they have representing Eve White in this film was a young white woman who at this time, I believe they wanted to bring up DID in a positive light, and I think if they, so to do that, they brought in a young white female to try to, at that time, this is something if they had brought up a person of color or someone who was maybe considered to be not the highest standard in society at that time, DID would not have been viewed in the way that it was. So that is why I believe it is so prominent in media today, as well as in psychology, because if it had affected someone who maybe was not considered to be important at that time, I do not think it would have been covered as much. And here are my references. Questions? Yes?
Do they think that she developed this as an adult at some point, or something that was from her childhood, her whole life?
So what they thought originally was they thought that this was something that she had just developed as late in life. They thought that since they hadn't, essentially her doctor was like, well, I haven't found it, why would it, so it had to have just happened. But essentially her life was, she experienced a lot of trauma in childhood, and then all throughout life she experienced people brushing her off and people not really acknowledging her problems as real problems. So I think that that's more the issue. They weren't really focusing on she was more just being dismissed around every corner than really being looked at for her mental health issues.
The doctor who finally diagnosed her, what made that doctor different? Why was that a different experience?
Right, so she actually, I only cut that explanation for time because she actually ended up switching, there was a time where she switched personalities while with her doctor. So she wrote he asked her to write a letter, it was supposed to be for her emotional well-being, because they thought she had depression. So they had her write a letter to her kids about, essentially just a love letter to her kids about how much she likes them. And the last paragraph was in children's handwriting. and was completely written differently than the rest. And it was written as a child, like it was essentially written. I think her personality, her mental age for that personality was around like 4 or 5. So it was like really messy writing. She wrote it said in the one of my references that she even held the pencil as like a toddler, held it like this and wrote it like that and it was completely different. Like it's been shown like in a lot of different writing things and stuff. Like there's writing professionals who can tell specifically if someone's writing matches up to another, and her writing, like it was so different that it was said, the professional said that it had to be from a different person. So
I think that's all the time for questions we have.